So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Dr. Paul Litchfield. Thank you again, Paul, for your support here this morning.
Thanks very much, Mary, and thanks for that. Good afternoon, everyone. If only it was as easy to get rid of a double chin with the camera angle. Some of us have lived with it for many years, so but there we are. I'm sure you'll forgive it. I'll try and share my screen now, which is always the interesting part of the evolution. There we go. And Mary will tell me if you can't see that. So if you don't see anything, I'll assume you can. So mental health at work, new world of work is what I've been asked to talk about. And as we've heard many times this today already, 2020 has been a dreadful year. It's turned the world upside down. We've all been subject to a range of new experiences, many of which have been really quite unpleasant, both socially and in terms of our work. And lots of people have had to adapt to new things like home working, being made redundant or furloughed. Financial hardship is more prevalent in our societies than it has been for a long time, and even food insecurity. In the most affluent, one of the most affluent parts of the world, children going hungry, and it's been a dreadful, dreadful year. And it's been made worse because we're all asking ourselves, so what's going to hit us next? It's uncertainty, it's continual change, and that's had a significant effect on the mental health of people in our societies. And we've seen rates of anxiety and depression increase. In the UK, pretty much doubled the pre-pandemic levels, and levels of well-being dropping. And we've been measuring in the UK well-being now in a systematic way for almost 10 years. And the levels that we're seeing during the pandemic are the lowest in any of those 10 years. So it's a pretty bad time. But of course, the thing is that a lot of the changes that we have seen happened have simply been accelerating the trends that we were already seeing. And it was Klaus Schwab, who's the founding chairman of the World Economic Forum, an organization I've been privileged to work with for about 15 years, who first coined the term the fourth industrial revolution. And what Klaus meant by that is that what started off in the late 18th century with mechanization, moving through the electrification of industry through to digitalization, has now reached the stage where we're bringing a whole range of things together, like neuroscience, big data, artificial intelligence, to create a new world that some call the Internet of Things. And that's transformed our lives at home, but in particular, our lives at work. And if we think about over our working lives, I started work back in the 1970s. And at that stage, about a third of the UK economy was devoted to manufacturing. These days, that's under 10%. What we have around the developed world is service industries dominating the economy. Competition is now global. And as we've seen only too graphically in the difficulties during the pandemic with things like access to PPE, supply chains are global too, but so are workforces. Workforces are mobile and they migrate. They migrate within countries and they migrate between countries. And I was reflecting as I was sat in the waiting room earlier, when I was walking the streets and it doesn't mean I was homeless, I was walking the streets in the west of Ireland back in the 60s. If you saw somebody who was black, people would literally stop in the street and turn around and stare. And yet these days we walk around the cities of our countries and we see a variety of different faces, we hear a variety of different languages. And that's because people are much more mobile than they used to be. And technology is the heart of that. Technology is replacing jobs, yes, and people worry about that. But it's changing jobs for even more people than those it replaces. And of course, it's creating new jobs too. So we have whole industries now that simply didn't exist 30 years ago. And the whole way that we think about work has changed. We used to talk about, and some still do, talk about going to work. Well, what does going to work mean these days? Work isn't a location anymore. It's what you do, not where you do it. Similarly, we used to talk about normal working hours. What does normal working hours mean? We used to say 9 to 5. What does that mean in a 24/7 economy? And of course, the reality is that working time for most of us is an extremely variable thing. And employment itself, you used to leave school, join an organisation with an expectation that you might well stay there for 40 years and then retire. That is vanishingly rare these days. People change jobs much more regularly. Many people carry out multiple jobs at the same time in what's increasingly a gig economy. So we're seeing multi-level change in the world of work. And that has many good aspects associated with it. But the reality is that most people find change threatening. There are a few people that embrace change, but most of us find it threatening. But the way that we respond to change is actually quite predictable. And Kubler-Ross first described this about 40 years ago now. And if you think about any major event that's occurred to you in your own lives, I think you'll recognize the phases that are on the slide there. So it starts off with that you freeze. You just don't know what's happening. You freeze like a rabbit in the headlights. You then try to deny that that change is happening. No, this can't be right. The police have come to the wrong door to telling me that somebody's been injured in a road accident. It can't be happening to me. Then we get angry. We might get angry with others, we might get angry with ourselves, and we move quickly from there into the stage where we start bargaining. Well, okay, you want to do this, but if I do that, can we do it in a different way? You might bargain yourself, you might bargain with God. You know, if only you'll take this away from me, I promise I really will go to church every day. You don't actually, you know, you won't hold your side of that bargain, but you still do it. And then routinely, we get low after that. And we've used the word depression on the slide. It can morph into clinical depression, but most people at this stage in dealing with the change process will feel a bit low about things, but we quickly, most of us come out of that. Some people get stuck in depression. Most people come out of it pretty quickly, and they start to test the waters. What's the new environment like? What does it actually mean to me? How can I deal with this? And that ultimately leads on to acceptance of the new normal. We adapt. Human beings are hugely adaptable creatures. We adapt to it and we move on. So we need to help people in that process. In our role in occupational health, we need to help people with it. On the right of the slide there, I've put some resources you might find useful. They are English resources. They're from NHS England, but nevertheless, you might find some of them useful, particularly in talking to younger people for whom this might be their first experience of major change. But the principles that we need to apply with anybody, and indeed with ourselves, are first of all to acknowledge that things are changing, take people out of that denial phase, to recognize that whatever the change is, even if it's good change, it's going to cause pressure. You might be moving to a new job that is a promotion with a higher salary. That's still going to cause pressure. So recognize that. Lots of things change, and at the moment, more things than usual are changing, but some things are constant. So where we have constants, keep them in our schedule. So maybe we normally go to choir on a Thursday evening. These days, that's probably likely to be more virtual than physical, but nevertheless, if it's something we do, keep those sorts of things going. Exercise in particular, maybe we go for a run every morning. Keep doing that. Take exercise and watch your nutrition. Make sure that you're eating properly during a period of change and pressure. We all have support networks, some are better than others. Activate them. That's harder at the moment in terms of the restraints on our ability to mix with other people, but most of us got pretty good at using social media. So let's use that and encourage others to do that, to reach out to people so that there are people there they can share their concerns and their worries with. Focus on the positive, not the negative. Get on the front foot. There are big aspects of change that you can't do anything about. So don't bother worrying about that. Control what you can. If your firm has decided to relocate to another town, to a new office, you're not going to be able, probably not going to be able to influence that. What you can do is control some of the aspects of your move to that. Maybe there's a particular pot plant that you like, take that with you. Maybe you like to sit near a window, or maybe you don't like to sit near a window. See if you can negotiate and control the things that you can have influence over, and not worry about the bigger things that frankly are going to happen whatever you say and whatever you do. We all get emotional. We all have our rants about change that we don't like, and that's normal and something which is probably good for us psychologically, but make sure that people do that in a safe place. A rant in the wrong place can create enormous problems for people. So encourage them to have their rant, sure, but to do it in a safe place. And then particularly, don't do it on social media. You don't know where stuff on social media is going to end up. It can come back to bite you years later. So just be extremely careful of venting emotions on social media. And finally, encourage people to be kind to themselves. We tend to be, particularly in the Western world, very hard on ourselves. We're often much kinder and more compassionate to others than we are to ourselves. So save a little bit of that kindness and compassion for ourselves. Now, of course, helping individuals to adapt to change is important, but in our role in occupational health, we have a responsibility to help organisations adapt too. And we can do that on the basis of evidence. There is good evidence now about how you can make change in a healthy way within an organisation. And the HIRES programme, European programme, which I was involved with, gosh, nearly 15 years ago now, produced, I think, some really good stuff, which is worth pulling out in our current situation, just looking at how that might help us to manage change better in our organisations. And the principles of any healthy organisational change are, first off, to make sure that people feel adequately supported, that as the change is put in place, that it's done in a fair way. And there are three elements to that, three elements to what's called organisational justice. The first is distributive justice, in other words, that you share out the good and the bad in a fair way, in a way that people feel is being done equally and fairly. That procedural justice, that you apply that. In other words, you decide, for example, there's a redundancy situation, you decide it's going to be first in, last out. That is a relatively common way of applying redundancy terms. If you do that, stick to it. As soon as you break that and say, well, actually, I know Charlie only joined us a year ago, but he's a fantastic guy and I really like him. So we're going to make an exception and keep him. As soon as you do that, you have blown your claim to procedural justice, and you will run into problems. So procedural justice. And the third one is interactional justice. In other words, communicating with people and making sure that you tell people as much as you can, as early as you can. And the last one is transparency. Be open as far as you can about what you're doing. That's sometimes difficult in a commercial environment because sometimes you need to maintain degrees of commercial secrecy, but be open about as much as you can. The arrows are just the phases that you typically go through in a major change program in an organization, and the boxes at the bottom are the things that you need to think about in the different phases of that process. And the one I would pull out is training for middle managers. We often forget middle managers, but they're absolutely critical in any change management program. Those at the top have the good ideas in the C-suite or the executive committee, and they pass them to others, typically the middle managers, to make it happen. The middle managers are coping with these good ideas that might not be so good after all, and having to make them land with a workforce who might be highly resistant. So they're under tremendous pressure. I often say that it's middle managers that translate chaos in an organisation. So pay particular focus on the middle managers, make sure they understand what's going on in terms of the change, and also that they're trained in change management principles and processes. So one of the things that we have seen particularly during the pandemic is remote working. And again, that's an acceleration of something that was happening anyway. So the bar chart shows the situation in Europe in 2018, and you can see that different sectors had different levels of remote working. So in manufacturing, relatively little; in IT and communication services, really quite a lot. And across Europe, there's a lot of disparity too. Ireland about middle of the pack for the EU27, an average of about 20% of people doing some sort of remote working. But what we've seen with the pandemic is, of course, that has accelerated dramatically. Most of the arrangements that organisations have put in place have been done quickly and therefore not particularly well thought out. The danger is those temporary measures start to become long-term measures, and every business now, every public sector organisation is under huge financial pressure. And the worry is, the danger is that cost savings will drive business behaviour, particularly in terms of the footprint of the organisation in things like office space, and we might end up doing things around remote working which aren't sensible. So there is learning that can be taken, particularly from the IT industry, where it's been the norm now for 20 odd years. We have to learn from that and make sure that we don't make mistakes that could be avoided. And you've probably gathered by now, I'm a keen Europhile, and desperately sad the UK made the decision to leave the EU, but there we go. But one of the good things we did in the IT and telecommunications sector when I was doing a lot of work with the Commission was to create a social partner framework through social dialogue. That's where the unions and the employers get together to agree the way to do things. And a framework agreement was agreed on telework, was agreed, I think it's back in 2005, it was a long time ago. But most countries around Europe actually implemented that very poorly. Ireland produced a code of practice over a decade ago now, but I don't think it's ever actually been formally endorsed, but you can still find it. There is some good advice in there, some good guidance. And the key things are to look at the work that's suitable for remote working, because some isn't, and the people that are suitable, types of person, type of role that's suitable for remote working, the skills and attributes that you need. And I put those in the boxes. I'm not, in the interest of time, going to go through all of those, but you'll get the slides afterwards, and I would commend those to you, but also to the code of practice, because it remains a valuable document. So if we think about remote working, then even in the codes of practice, the mental health around Europe, the mental health impact has largely been neglected. Now, I've called it the UK Health and Safety Executive, to which I profoundly apologise. It is, of course, the Great Britain Health and Safety Executive. Northern Ireland has a separate organisation, but nevertheless, the stress management standards produced a while ago now by the HSE are a sensible way to look at this. And that talks about 3 stressors: demands, controls, support relationships, role, and change. And when we think about those in the context of remote working, then for some it's neutral, which I've coded blue, color-coded blue. Some, there are benefits to remote working, which I've color-coded green. And there are some where it causes potential harm to mental health, and those I've color-coded red. So with demands, yes, you don't have things like commuting, which particularly for those who live in cities or work in cities can be a real issue. But the danger is you're always on when you're working mostly remotely. Control in general, people have a higher level of discretion with remote working than they do when they're in a more structured office environment. But support, it's very easy to get isolated if you're working remotely, and we need to be aware of that. Relationships, you get less conflict with remote working. The organisation I worked with for almost 20 years did an awful lot of remote working, and we found there was less conflict. But if you did get conflict with a remote worker, it was much harder to resolve. And then with roles, people's roles are usually well defined if you put them into a remote working situation, and that's on the positive side. But when any further changes are going on, it's very easy to feel out of the loop as a remote worker, and that can be a source of impaired mental health. So as we move to more remote working, and I don't think it's something that's going to go away, we need to plan it. And I put there some bullet points about the sorts of things that we should be thinking about. So which roles and people are suitable. Think about contact. Contact is the hardest thing for remote workers, and if you don't plan it, it won't happen. So think about how you're going to establish a routine of regular contact, particularly with managers, but also with peers. So the way that you structure team meetings, think about the channels that you're going to use if you can't meet physically, but try and get some physical meetings if you can. And think about the social aspects of work and set up in parallel to the formal systems, the formal channels, that you have some informal channels so that people can talk to each other without it being an official email or an official discussion in some way. Make sure people have well-defined work packages and clear milestones on their performance. You probably should do that in whatever situation, but it's particularly important with remote working. Encourage people to budget their time, and as a manager, make sure that time is budgeted so that you don't get fluctuations in workload, or you'll find people working till 3 o'clock in the morning, because it's much easier to do that if you're working at home than in the office. Remote working means that IT becomes absolutely critical. So make sure that the support people have and their capability for using the IT is top line. If it isn't, it's all going to fall apart. And when people do come in to a shared space, into an office, make sure that you make maximum use of those visits, because it becomes incredibly valuable time. And I think what we need to do in general as society is reimagine the purpose of the office. For too many offices are basically little cubicles where people come in, work like battery hens, and then go out again. And the office really is more important in terms of relationships and communication between people. And if you look at organizations like Google and some of the other tech companies, they've actually given a lot of thought to the design of their offices, and there's some learning that we can all get from there in terms of getting offices that are more suitable for the 21st century. Now, the world of work has changed a lot, has adapted. Occupational health has changed a lot over the last 30 or 40 years, but I have to say, in my view, it's not always changed for the better. If we think about what most people in occupational health do these days, you can break it down into 4 main pillars, which if you're in a commercial organisation translate to income streams. So there's pre-employment medicals. The evidence base for pre-employment medicals is incredibly thin, and indeed there's quite good evidence that it's essentially quite useless. And that's starting to feed through, and people are doing far less these days in pre-employment health checks than they would have done, say, 15 or 20 years ago. Health surveillance used to be, or has been, a key part of what we do in occupational health. The reality is that hazards that require health surveillance tend to get engineered out or, in my view, shamefully exported to countries in other parts of the world that aren't as well regulated. So there's less need for health surveillance, and that's a continuing trend. A lot of us end up doing sickness absence management, the reality is that our influence there is probably marginal. And the way that we look at that with a medical model mindset probably doesn't make us as effective as we could be. And then the last one relates to pensions and medical retirement. That's really related very much to defined benefit schemes, which are dying out around the UK and elsewhere. Really that's a declining revenue stream too. And the consequence of all that is we've been boxed into a corner. Instead of looking at all the aspects of the interplay between health and work, which is what occupational health is all about, too often we only look at the impact of bad health on work and the way that it harms work. And that means that to a large extent, we are becoming peripheral to the modern work agenda. So before everybody starts rushing out and thinking, I need to find a new career, I don't think it is as depressing as it could be, because there is a way out of that. But it means breaking free of the medical model of health. We need to think about the biopsychosocial elements that make up health. And one way of doing that is through well-being. And the construct that we've developed at the What Works Centre is to look at the things that drive well-being in the workplace. And you can break those down into health, of course, is important, physical, psychological and emotional health, but it's also people's security, their safety at work, their physical safety at work, their financial security, their contractual security. It's also about relationships, of course, relationships at work, relationships with managers, relationships with peers, but it's also the broader relationships with family and community that that influence the way that people are going to be feeling, and therefore the way that they're going to perform at work. And then the fourth element of the light blue there is environment. And that's partly the physical environment, but it's also the culture of the organization. And increasingly it's the systems that we work to, not just the IT systems, but the work processes which drive most types of work these days. And what philosophers would describe those light blue elements as are hedonic drivers of well-being. Hedonism in its proper meaning of the term is about the way that human beings try to minimize pain and maximize pleasure in life. And so those four elements are all about reducing the bad things, increasing the good things in our lives. But human beings require more than that. And that's what it's termed the eudaimonic element by philosophers. And that is that we all need to feel as human beings, perhaps uniquely in the animal kingdom, we need to feel that there is more to life than just feeding ourselves and staying warm. There needs to be some meaning in life. And so purpose is a key part of getting people's well-being up in the workplace. And that isn't just about engagement, which HR colleagues spend a lot of time talking about. Before you have engagement, you have to have belief in what you're doing, belief in what the organization is doing. And then to sustain engagement, you have to have commitment. And so if we do that and move away from that medical model, that health paradigm, to a well-being one, then it broadens our input in the workplace. And I would suggest it also addresses what really matters in the workplace rather than just one component of that. I'm not going to say anything really about health because you all understand that probably a lot better than I do. But I think the link between health and well-being is intuitive, and there's all sorts of ways of dealing with that these days, and there's loads of apps you can use, and we need to understand it. We need to point people to the right sort of solutions, but I think that's something that we cover pretty well in occupational health. It's the other elements that we need to think more about. And I'll just touch quickly on some of those four other elements that I spoke about. So security, if we're thinking about financial well-being, not something in occupational health we might have thought about much years ago, but it impacts on people's well-being. And it's something that is increasingly being thought about in the world of work. What you can do as an employer is, at its simplest, you can give people access to workplace financial advice, do that through your EAP perhaps. You can perhaps think about zero cost ways of helping people to consolidate loans. Or you can even think about ways, again at zero cost to the company, of providing advance payment on their salaries. When I first started working, I used to get paid on a Thursday evening in a brown envelope with cash. And we moved away from that to monthly payment into people's bank accounts, not because people were demanding it, but because it was useful for the banks, it saved them money, and it was useful for companies because it helped with their cash flow. But actually, when you look at the way people use money, most still do it on a weekly basis. So one of the ways that advance payment work is for the work that you've already done, it just gives you that money a bit earlier than waiting until the end of the month. Relationships are important. Now, we don't want to turn companies into marriage counsellors, but we know that the peak time for relationships to break down is when people are in their mid to late 40s. That's when the majority of relationships break down. Who are those people? They're our most experienced technicians. They're our key middle managers. They're the people who are emerging talent in terms of about to take over the top jobs in our organisations. So why wouldn't we want to give them some sort of support? And that might be as simple as signposting to relationship counselling or psychological support or legal advice. Doesn't have to cost much money. The environment, as I said, the built environment is important, particularly as so many organisations are going to be moving to new premises, smaller premises over the next couple of years. Think about doing that. Don't just move into any old premises. Think about things like the air quality, active design, things like the daylight and the lighting in an office can make a tremendous difference to the way people feel, their mental health, their well-being. We need to understand these things in occupational health. We need to be giving that advice to businesses. It expands our portfolio, it expands our influence. And then, as I said before, with purpose, it's more than about just engagement. It's about belief in the organisation. It's about sustaining it by keeping people happy at work. And it's then that then gives real business benefits. Now, too often we focus on just the individual. And promoting individual well-being, that's great. And organisations can do a great deal. I would suggest that if you just stop there, then it's a dereliction of duty. So organisations that say, oh, well, we've given people free gym membership and fruit on a Friday, it's now over to them. It's their responsibility to sort out their own well-being. I think that is morally wrong. Similarly, a lot of effort these days goes into helping people to build their personal resilience. That's great. I wouldn't discourage that at all, but that can't be an excuse for then loading them with unreasonable levels of pressure. So we need to think about the organisation as well as the individual, just as we did with the other drivers of well-being. And the key thing there is work quality. And we know we have the evidence, and this is just a screenshot from some stuff on the What Works Wellbeing website, which I would commend to you. There is a range of evidence about what a good job means and how that then gives people higher levels of well-being. And the key principles are designing the job well, designing the organisation in a way that minimizes harm, maximizes well-being. It's about getting the right sort of culture and leadership. It's not rocket science, but it's something we need to understand and we need to be out there banging the drum about. Because there is no doubt, the evidence base is growing, that if we do that, there are real benefits to businesses. Now, it hasn't happened this year because of the pandemic, but in a normal year, the Global Council for Happiness and Wellbeing, which I am part of, produce a policy report. What's up there is the report from 2019. I would commend it to you. If you look at, I'm pretty certain it's chapter 6. It's all online, it's free to download. If you look at chapter 6, it gives you a whole range of evidence about work and well-being and the impact that good well-being has on businesses. And at an individual level, there's good experimental evidence that you can get a 10% productivity increase if you focus on people's well-being and improve it. And there's also good evidence at an individual level that you get improvements in service quality. When we look at data from organisations, and one of the things I did just before I left British Telecom was set up a study that looked at around about 15,000 contact centre workers, mapped their well-being on a regular basis and linked that to performance against business parameters. And that and other studies show that if you increase well-being, you increase customer loyalty, you improve things like Net Promoter Score, which an improvement in Net Promoter Score in a service industry, people will bite your hands off to get that. You get increase in productivity, and that translates into revenue per person. And we prove that at BT, increased profitability and reduced staff turnover, the people that you don't want to lose. So the evidence is there. Well-being improves business performance. We should be making that case. We should be putting ourselves at the heart of helping organisations to make those improvements. Because I think well-being is at the heart of our people proposition. And if we look at it that way, then you start to become at the centre of the way a business operates and not on the periphery, which is where we have tended to drift to in recent years in occupational health. It takes us up from the value for money services, the routine medicals, the return to work, sickness absence referrals. That sort of thing is transactional work. I'm not saying it's not important. It needs to be done, but we are much better than that. We are much bigger than that. We need to move up the value chain. We need to be thinking about how we can add value to the business, and in particular, how we can create value for the business. And if you put well-being at the heart of that, you start to influence not just health, not just safety, you influence a whole range of other things that I've put in the circle there. Things like reward, organisational design, employee relations, even things like communications, corporate social responsibility and environment, risk and legal, all start coming to you, talking to you about how to improve things in their areas, because they can see that what we are doing, what you will be doing, is actually making a difference to the way that they work and the way that the whole business operates more effectively. So I hope I've made the case that promoting well-being at work is the future. It allows us to move from that bottom left quadrant where so many of us sit at the moment and starting to influence those other three quadrants, which are part of occupational health. They always have been and they always should be. And if we do that, we get some practical benefits, which I put alongside those quadrants. But ultimately, what we're doing then is good for workers, it's good for organisations, it's good for society. And that gives us a strong sense of purpose. And that in turn means that our own well-being is better. So I think you've gathered, I think possibly even passionately, it's the right thing to do. And I hope it might influence your practice in the future. Thanks, Mary.
Thank you very much, Dr. Litchfield. That was very interesting. Lots of points there for consideration. We have a number of questions, which is great. So I'm just going to get your thoughts on these. So you talked about the management standards, and certainly we're very much familiar with them here as well in Ireland, and the HSE in Ireland followed suit with the HSE. And you talked about why it's maybe more difficult to manage conflict for remote workers. Maybe if you could just expand on that point a little bit further, maybe why that would be the case.
Yeah, sure. Why is managing conflict more difficult? It's because people are isolated. So if somebody is in an office environment and they're not off sick, because as I expect everybody on the call has experience of where you have a conflict at work, somebody goes sick, and it then gets really difficult to manage the whole situation. It's similar with remote workers. If you're in the office, you can talk to people. If there's a conflict, you can diffuse it at an earlier stage. You can see from people's body language that they're not happy. You can hear it in the tone of their voice, and you can intervene. You can do things in a different way to diffuse things at an early stage. If you say something which is sharp and you can see that you've upset somebody, you can go to them at the end of the meeting and say, I'm sorry, I was a bit sharp there, and why don't we go and have a cup of coffee and talk about it? That's much harder to do with Zoom meetings or Teams meetings or Google Hangouts meetings or whatever you do. Yes, you could send them a note afterwards on chat, or you could send them an email, but it doesn't land in quite the same way. So it is harder to resolve conflict when people are working remotely. So you just need to think about it and think about how you might try to address it.
Thank you, and worth certainly considering, and first outlining that to our business people. I had a question myself that we talk a little bit about, I suppose, absenteeism. Interesting enough, the research we did even in lay healthcare showed that absenteeism levels actually would seem to be getting lower. They're not being reported. Is there an increasing instance of presenteeism? Would that be coming through, or are you familiar with that maybe in some international studies?
Do you mean in terms of remote working?
Yes, and remote working. Do you see there's a change in that sort of coming through with remote working? Because we've seen from the research that actually there seems to be a decrease in absenteeism with remote. So there's more of an increase in presenteeism on that basis of that?
Yeah. So that is entirely typical, and some of it is real, because for me, coming to work at the moment means getting out of bed, which isn't always easy. That duvet can be really sticky sometimes, but getting out of bed, getting myself ready as I would do if I was going to an office, but then just coming down the stairs and coming into my home office. I don't have to think, oh God, I've got to drive to the station. I've got to get on a train. I've then got to get into London and get on the tube. And if I'm not feeling great, or the weather's awful, then of course I'm much less likely to do that. I'm much more likely to be able to come downstairs to my office. So you do see some genuine improvements in absenteeism, but you're quite right. The downside of that is you have more people working ineffectively when they're not feeling well, because they are inclined to, I'll still log on, I'll still do stuff, but I'm not working that greatly. I think the perhaps more important though is, and at BT we really went hell for leather for remote working back in the late 90s, because the technology was emerging and we were selling it to other organizations. At one stage we had over 15,000 dedicated home workers, so not just people that worked remotely from time to time, and that number was up at around 60,000, but 15,000 dedicated home workers. And what we found was that what appeared to be initial improvements in productivity declined over time, and they declined partly because of a natural decay, but also because people felt less engaged with the business. Team working was damaged, innovation was damaged. We had less creativity because people were isolated and not able to have those informal conversations that you can have when you're co-located with people. And as a result of that, 5 or 6 years ago now, there's possibly more than that, we started to move away from as much home working. So started to no longer encourage, and in some cases discourage it, look more closely at what work really was suitable for home working. And that was driven by the software development part of the business, because they saw most particularly that it was having negative consequences for them in terms of coming up with the bright ideas, and creating new products and services for customers. So there is a downside to remote working, particularly when it translates into full-time home working, that we need to be aware of, and we need to be making the case to the businesses that we support that there is that it's not the silver bullet, that the finance director might be delighted that you can save 2/3 of your accommodation needs, but there's a cost associated with that, and you won't see that cost in the first 12 months, but my goodness, you'll see it in the succeeding 3 or 4 years. So certainly the businesses I advise these days, that's what I'm saying to them, is think very carefully about what the new world of work looks like in terms of your office provision. And as I said in the presentation, design the offices in a way that give you the things that are going to improve creativity, improve collaboration, rather than just a big floor of these dreadful booths that always remind me of a chicken factory.
Thank you, Paul. And that's a good thing. And of course, we recognise certainly in the UK, there's probably a lot more, you know what I mean, experience in this whole area. So it's good to hear these learnings, certainly, and that we should consider them. I have one last point, and I think it's very much, I don't know, is it a question or more of an observation, but we'll welcome your thoughts on it. And it is that, do you think that occupational health professions, we don't sell ourselves enough to senior management, that we should be more embedded an integral part of the business, not just seen as a service provider, be more proactive? And maybe some, I suppose, with your experience in occupational health and seeing the change in occupational health, maybe some tips on how we as occupational health professionals could do that.
So absolutely. I think we have a really valuable role to play in helping businesses to be, and public sector organisations, be successful in the 21st century, but only if we draw in these other ideas and broaden our appeal to the businesses. The way that, particularly in the UK, but other countries too, the way that it has gone over the last 20, 30 years really, is to more outsourcing of services. And there's nothing wrong with an outsourced service at all, but it does rely very much on the specification that the customer draws up. It's hard to expand beyond that specification. And if the customer doesn't have any in-house knowledge of what they should be looking for, then, and I don't mean this unkindly, but they are an ignorant customer. They don't know what they should be asking for. So without being patronizing, we need to help to educate them about what we can offer. So part of that is the way that we market ourselves. I think it's also, and it's certainly been a trend in the UK over the last 10 years, more of us need to work in-house, but not as an alternative to outsourced services, but to supplement outsourced services, so that you have a small number of people within the organization who are helping the organization to develop their thoughts and to buy in the services that are going to be appropriate for them and help them to run an efficient business and grow their business. So I see it very much as a hybrid of in-house and outsource, where we work as collaborators rather than seeing each other as the enemy. Too often in-house people see outsourced folk as a threat. Too often outsourced people see the in-house people as potentially a threat. So we need to get much better at working collaboratively. Ultimately, certainly I have, and I think most of us have spent time both working in-house and out-house. So, you know, it's not genetic. You're not genetically an outsourced person or genetically an in-house person. It's something we can all do. So let's work together, work as colleagues for the betterment of the businesses, but also for the betterment of our profession, and give it the status that it deserves. Occupational health shouldn't be like contract cleaning. It shouldn't be something that somebody low down in procurement makes decisions on, and essentially makes the decision based purely on cost. I think we're better than that. We deserve to be treated better than that. We will only be treated better than that if we make the case properly.
Thank you, Paul, for that point. One or two more questions. Sorry, they're all coming.
I thought you were going to say.
No, I know, and I'm sorry now. We won't delay you much longer. You know what I mean? So I think it was you touched on sort of, I suppose, a good office, I suppose, and maybe could you give us an example? The question is of what a good office would look like. You mentioned the pods and all that, so obviously not a good office. What would be the ideal thing? Maybe looking at how we're working now as such, or as we come back into maybe workplaces. You know?
Yep. So think about what you're trying to achieve. You're trying to achieve a situation where people share ideas. So a good office becomes a place where people want to come and where they can get those social relationships, establish them and develop them. That's at the heart. And ask people what they want. It must be. Ooh, we were building a new research, not the research centre was there in BT, but we were building a new part of it. And the guy who was running it said to the teams, because the other two research centres, one was in San Antonio, one was in Kuala Lumpur, he said, I suppose the key thing you really want is video conferencing, which 15 years ago was not that common. And they said, no, actually, what we want is interactive whiteboards, because they were software designers. And what they wanted to be able to do was put something up on the whiteboard in Ipswich, and someone from Kuala Lumpur can go, no, it's not like that, it's like this. And someone in San Antonio can go, well, actually, if you do it this way, it'll look better. So ask the people what works for them in terms of making their lives better, their lives more efficient, but particularly focus on those social aspects and bringing people together. And the other thing, particularly for younger people, new entrants, I think this remote world is really, really tough if you're starting out in an organization or you're very junior in an organization. How on earth do you develop that sense of being part of a team? If you're new to an organization, you've never met the people you're working with, how do you advance your career in a virtual world? How do you make your mark as a young person so people go, oh, well, actually, Carol's really bright and she's someone we should keep an eye on and advance her. How do you do? It's much, much tougher. So when we have the opportunity to come together in a physical space, we need to think about how we're going to give our younger people, our talent, if you like, exposure that they need in order to develop their careers and to advance. So it would be those, think about the relationships, think about the psychological aspects of what we're doing, and not just, oh, it's more if we can get 40 people in this space if we cram them into these little cubicles. That is not the way we should be building back.
Thank you, Paul. One last question. You just touched on, this is the final one, I promise you now, because there was just some interest there. You touched on it, and it was around, that seems to be an emerging trend, is I think that the difficulties about people experiencing in relation to getting promotion when they're not working in the workplace. So you actually led into this question very nicely as such, you know what I mean? And I suppose this seems to be, as one of our on the commission, on the conference there, said that this is emerging. So maybe just expand on that last point, I think, is, and how do we address that maybe from an occupational health or support business in that area, you know?
So I think our key role in occupational health is to flag it up as a potential issue to those who have influence and control over the way that things are going to develop in the next year or two. I think there will be very few businesses outside of manufacturing, but service industries, there will be very few that don't look to reduce their footprint in terms of accommodation. And they'll do it because we've proved out of necessity that you can do a lot of work remotely, and that's a good thing. But it's also going to be the financial realities that office buildings are really very expensive. And if you can reduce your footprint by a half or a third, then you make a real difference to the top line and to the bottom line. So what we need to do is get across that, yeah, great, not say, no, you mustn't do that, because that will just portray us as being negative, but say, yeah, of course, this is what we must do. But in doing it, let's pay attention to these things that will actually make us work effectively in that new way, which means reimagining what people are coming into the office to do and building an environment that works for that, rather than one that works for essentially when typing pools were normal. And you look at most office accommodation these days, it's essentially based on when you had hundreds or dozens of people sat there typing things out, and they're big typing pools, and that's balmy when you think about what people are actually doing these days. So think about what people are doing. How are you going to create a space that works for them? Think about the spaces where they're going to mix when they're not tied to their workstation, so make those attractive. Think about the colors that you're using, and that's one of the things we've done when I've been advising organizations about creating an environment that's good for well-being. Think about the colors you put on the walls. Think about the soft furnishings. Think about all of the things that are going to influence the way that people feel, the way their mood goes. And as I said in the presentation, lighting is absolutely critical. The amount of daylight we get has a huge impact on the way that we feel. Artificial lighting has changed dramatically in the last 30 years. It used to be incandescent bulbs, then it was fluorescent bulbs, then it was halogen bulbs. Now it's mostly LED lighting. You look at any of the lighting standards in the UK or Europe or the States, those lighting standards have not kept pace with the change in the technology. And there are things you can do with LED in terms of the spectrum of the light, in terms of the quality of the light, that make a huge difference to people's moods. Now, we need to understand that as professionals. It's not difficult science, but we need to know about it, we need to think about it, and we need to communicate it to those who are planning the new office moves. And then they're going to say, oh my God, I didn't think Mary would be talking to me about lighting. And it just opens their eyes to what we can offer them in occupational health, instead of just saying, oh yeah, that's the person we send someone to when they go sick.
Good. Yes, that we need to change that conversation. Listen, it's been wonderful having you here this morning with us, Dr. Litchfield. Thank you very much for answering all the questions. Hopefully we'll get the opportunity to get you over to Ireland and as we normally do, and we'll get to meet in person and face to face. So again, thank you very much for your support today. Delighted to have you.